What if saying the wrong thing could get you deported? That's the question at the heart of one of the most explosive controversies in America right now, featuring 2 Columbia students arrested by US immigration forces. Mahmoud Khalil and Mohsen Mahdawi were both student leaders involved in anti-Israel activism on campus, and their cases have sparked national headlines and a ton of debate. Some people see them as free speech heroes, symbols of what happens when political expression is punished. Others see them as dangerous Hamas supporters, openly hostile to their host country. And they're not the only ones. Over the past 2 months, the government revoked the visas of hundreds of international students accused of supporting Hamas and promoting hate speech on college campuses. But despite the media coverage, most people really don't understand the legal issues, because this area of law is extremely complicated, with some questions that have never even been answered. Khalil was the first to be arrested, and his case is the furthest along. So let's dig into the issues and answer the question, should he be deported? Mahmoud Khalil is an Algerian citizen who came to the US in 2022 on a student visa. Since then, he married a US citizen, got his green card, and finished his degree. While at Columbia, Khalil became a prominent voice in anti-Israel activism. He served as a spokesman and negotiator for CUAD, which was one of the main student groups organizing protests on campus. And this is where the controversy gets started. Khalil is accused of leading demonstrations that allegedly crossed the line into harassment and vandalism. He's also accused of spreading pro-Hamas propaganda, including direct statements from Hamas, which is considered a terrorist organization under US law. CUAD came under fire for its own messaging, like this post calling for the total eradication of Western civilization. Supporters defending Khalil say it's unfair to hold him personally responsible for the actions of other protesters. They point out that Khalil himself has never been charged with any crime, and they say he's getting politically targeted just for exercising his free speech. In early March, ICE arrested Khalil and immediately moved him to a detention center in Louisiana, which raised some eyebrows. He was living in New York, so why ship him across the country? Critics worried it was a form of punishment, or a way to isolate him from his lawyers and community. And those concerns are completely valid. This kind of transfer can make it a lot harder to access support. But the truth is, Khalil wasn't singled out with this treatment. For better or worse, this is pretty standard for ICE. They often transfer detainees to remote detention centers with available space. But what is unusual is the official reason for Khalil's detention. The government is relying on a rarely used provision in immigration law that lets the Secretary of State declare that someone's presence would cause serious adverse foreign policy consequences. In other words, if this guy says you're bad for foreign policy, he can revoke your green card and kick you out of the country. If that sounds like a really vague standard, that's because it is. But we'll get to that. There's another justification for deporting Khalil that people have been talking about.
Our law makes clear if you endorse or espouse terrorist activity, you can be removed from this country.
He's right that those laws exist, but for some reason the Trump administration isn't citing them as a basis for deporting Khalil. They're relying solely on the foreign policy provision. And this matters because of the precedent it could set for the future. If Khalil were being deported for endorsing terrorism, the message would be simple: don't endorse terrorism. But if he gets deported because of vague foreign policy concerns, that gives the administration way more leeway. Could they start deporting people for criticizing US policy on Ukraine? Could a future administration use the same justification to deport people who support Israel? The point is, it's not just about whether Khalil gets deported, but how and why that really matters. So what happens next? Khalil's case is currently in immigration court, where a judge already ruled that he can be deported under the foreign policy statute. But immigration courts are actually part of the executive branch, not the judicial branch. So they don't even consider whether laws are constitutional. Their only job is to apply the law as written. Khalil can now appeal the decision within the immigration court system. Once there's a final immigration ruling, that's when the real legal battle begins. Because only then can Khalil bring his case to the US Court of Appeals, where he can finally challenge the deportation statute on constitutional grounds. So what are the constitutional issues? First is due process, which means the government can't just punish you without a reason. It has to give you a fair opportunity to argue your case. But do non-citizens also have the right to due process? Yes, of course. Because the only way due process works is if you grant it to everyone. Think about it. What if the government claims you're not a citizen? How could you prove that you really are unless you have a chance to argue your case in court? In practice, you can't ensure due process for anyone unless you give it to everyone. Next is free speech. Do non-citizens really have First Amendment rights? Yes, even if you're not a citizen, the government can't throw you in jail just because it doesn't like what you say. But there's a catch. Just because the government can't criminally punish you for protected speech doesn't mean it can't deport you for it. Deportation isn't considered a criminal punishment. So yes, in some cases, a non-citizen can be deported based solely on what would otherwise be protected speech. So what will the court decide? On Khalil's side, he can argue that the law being used against him is so vague that it fails to give people fair notice of what's not allowed. He can also argue that he's being selectively targeted based on his ethnicity, religion, or political views, in a way that violates his right to equal treatment and due process. But the government can argue that the courts should defer to the Secretary of State on foreign policy judgments. And courts traditionally do give a lot of deference in this area. But on the other hand, right now the government seems to be relying on the bare minimum. They're even trying to use a special provision that allows them to deport Khalil not based on any actual conduct, but based solely on his beliefs, statements, or associations. This raises serious First Amendment concerns, which is why that provision puts a higher burden on the government. They need to demonstrate a compelling foreign policy interest instead of just a potentially serious interest. What's the difference between compelling and potentially serious? It means the courts will be less deferential to the administration. But exactly how much less? We'll have to wait and see. At its core, this case raises a fundamental legal question. What kind of justification should the US government need to deport a green card holder? And the answer will have to balance the right to free speech and due process against the government's power to control who's allowed to stay in the country. There's a lot at stake and a lot of strong opinions, but it's important to separate facts from talking points. Some of Khalil's supporters have claimed that he's been disappeared or kidnapped, but that's not true. He's being held under the authority of a statute, and he's getting his due process. To be fair, the Trump administration has pushed past the legal limits in some cases, like trying to use an 18th century wartime law to deport Venezuelan nationals without hearings. But the Supreme Court already made an emergency ruling to ensure due process going forward. Khalil's case is different. He has a lawyer. He'll have a chance to appeal. He'll have his day in court. If you actually want to support the rule of law, great. Hold up a sign that says, "Give Khalil due process." But if your message is free Khalil, you're not supporting the rule of law. You're supporting Khalil personally, regardless of the facts. And by doing that, you're revealing your own bias. The same goes for the other side. If you think Khalil shouldn't get due process because you don't like his views, then you're also missing the point. Because if you give up due process for the people you don't like, then you've given it up for yourself too. Whatever the outcome of this case, there will be one clear winner, and that's the rule of law. The legal system is far from perfect, but it's still rooted in truth, fairness, and the protection of basic rights. Even when we don't like the outcome, we can still be proud of the process.